Well, welcome to Morning Manna. This is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. Our topic is two ways. Yesterday, I pointed out how many times the Bible speaks of choosing between two options. Adam and Eve had two trees. Jeremiah said God had set before the Israelites the way of life and the way of death. Jeremiah also said that people had to choose between two paths, the old paths and the new paths. God told the Hebrews they had two choices, life or death. Jesus said people must choose between two gates, a narrow gate and a wide gate. Elijah said the Israelites had to choose between two opinions about whom to follow and worship, God or Baal. Apostle Peter spoke often about two ways. He said we must choose between the right way and the wrong way. He said that there is a way of truth and a way of destruction. Peter said that there's a right way and the way of Balaam. And Peter said there is the way of righteousness and a way of sin. Now, it's no wonder that Christians were known for centuries as people of the way. Jesus said He is the way. The way of what? The way of salvation, the way to God the Father, the way of life, the way of light, the way to victory over death and hell. We read in Acts chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, Saul, still breathing out threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and requested letters from him to the synagogues of Damascus, so that if he found any there, listen to this, if he found any there of the way, either men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. So Saul, who later became Paul, had letters from the high priest in Damascus saying, if you know anybody of the way, tell me about it. I'll have them arrested. They were called people of the way. Now, have you ever read the Didache? It's spelled D-I-D-A-C-H-E, Didache. Have you ever heard its name? I had never heard of it until, about 16, 17 years ago, when the Lord opened my eyes to the writings of the early church fathers. I didn't know such documents from the first 4 centuries of the church even existed. Here, I had been a Christian since 1978. I was in church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, at every revival, every crusade, anytime the church had a function, I was there. And I had never heard of the church fathers. Didn't know that there were writings from the church fathers. And at first, when I found out about it, I was angry. I was angry at the church leaders throughout my life for hiding it from me. I felt like they had concealed from me knowledge of my spiritual ancestors, my relatives in Christ. But I later figured out why modern churches and denominations don't talk about the early church writings. And it's real simple, because the doctrine and the traditions of the early church were radically different from what is taught today under the guise of Christianity. What we have today in America is American churchianity. It has little resemblance to first century Christianity. Now, one important early church document you should read and study is the Didache. And listen, it's available online. Again, it's spelled D-I-D-A-C-H-E. You can find the transcripts on many websites. You can buy copies of the book, but it's there to read. It's a very short document. And a lot of websites that are devoted to early church teachings have the Didache on their website. Now listen, the Didache is well known among pastors and theologians and congregation members of the older traditional churches. Obviously, the the Orthodox churches of the East, the Lutheran churches, the Anglican churches. Those old churches know about the Didache, and they talk about it. But when you get into America in the modern churches, whether we're talking about the Southern Baptists or the Pentecostals, the Charismatics, they don't know anything about it. And if they do know anything about it, they don't want to talk about it. But the Didache is also known as the teaching of the 12 apostles. Now, the early church accepted this document as an authentic church manual that was given from the 12 apostles. That's why it's called the teaching of the 12 apostles. It purports to be directly given to the church from the apostles about teaching, doctrine, worship, and rules for the management of the church. It is dated to the 1st century, and it is the oldest church manual ever found. An ancient Greek manuscript was discovered by Archbishop Philotheos Bryennios, Metropolitan of Nicomedia, in the year 1873. So I don't know what date, many centuries ago, that the Didache was basically lost to the Western churches. Like I said, it's always been known with the Eastern churches in the Middle East, Syria, Iran, Iraq, Armenia. Those churches have always known about the Didache. But the Western churches lost knowledge of it, and I don't know at what point that took place. But I do know that it was in 1873 that a Greek Orthodox Archbishop, Bryennios, discovered the document. Now, I want to show you something. I have here this book. All right, I buy old books. I haven't been in a Christian bookstore in years, and the reason is I don't want to catch an STD. You can get an STD in Christian bookstores. That's a spiritually, all right, I said STD, a spiritually transmitted disease. I mean, you can get one in a Christian bookstore. You go in there and buy that stuff that's being published today as Christian, you're going to get yourself a spiritual disease. So I only buy now old books. And the older, the better. And I search for them and I read these old books. So this is the teaching of the 12 apostles. And it is written by Professor Philip Schaff. Professor Schaff was a German Reformed Church theologian in the 1800s, a brilliant man. Brilliant man. He was professor of theology at the Mercersburg Theological Seminary for the German Reformed Church in Mercersburg, Pennsylvania. And I'll just tell you a little personal story about this. I didn't know my own family background. I went to church as a child with my grandparents, and it was an old German Reformed church. I grew up in Western Maryland. That church was built in 1742, and the only structures in the Appalachian Mountains back in 1742 were the cabins of the settlers from Europe and a fort, a stone fort that was built by George Washington. And that's Fort Frederick. As a kid, I often played cowboys and Indians inside Fort Frederick. And I drank water from a spring where George Washington's troops got water for their canteens. All right, so that's the kind of, childhood I had. It was just, history was around me, and I just was I just assumed that was everybody's experience, all right? Gettysburg, Antietam, this was all in the general area where I grew up. Well, my family, I didn't know, I didn't understand that my family was German Reformed. I remember going to church with my grandparents. The only church I had any church experience was going with my grandparents when I was a little kid. And I didn't understand German Reform or any of that kind of stuff. And I didn't understand my family history until just a few years ago when I was home with, I went back to my home place to attend a funeral of my aunt who had, my late father's sister. And she was the last of that generation. They're all gone. And so I went back for the funeral. And the funeral was in that old German Reformed church. It's no longer German Reformed. That denomination is gone these days. But Western Maryland, where I grew up, was basically a German settlement. And these were all Germans that settled. They came down through Pennsylvania, down through the Cumberland mountains, and came into the valley and settled there to get away from the papal wars of Europe. And so the pastor of that church during that funeral said, this woman, talking about my aunt, said, she comes from a family that has a long history in this church. Well, that statement got my attention. And so after the funeral, I talked to someone, and I said, what did the pastor mean about that? And he said, you got a few minutes to walk through the cemetery? And he took me through the cemetery, and he showed me grave markers of my family. And I saw relatives that had passed away all through the 1800s. I think the earliest one I saw was my great-great-grandmother's grave. Great-great-grandmother. And I realized, and it says, this is on all sides of my family. My father's side, his mother and father, all right? On my mother's side, all these German Reformed people were buried in the cemetery. And I realized, I came to understand that I'm 100% German, and that I came from Christians who fled Europe in the early 1700s to get away from the Roman Catholic wars that were tearing up Europe at that time between the Catholics and the Protestants. And so this was a major revelation to me. So that night, I was reading one of these books by Philip Schaff. And this is the history of the Christian church. And I think there's 11 books in this set. I think it's 11. Philip Schaff is the foremost church historian. And the history of the Christian church is the best written record of everything that is known about the church from the day of Pentecost until the mid-1800s when this book was written. Like I said, about 11 in the set. And so that night after the funeral, I was reading one of these Philip Schaff books. And I thought, who is Philip Schaff? And so I just, went online, and I guess I went to Wikipedia, and that's when I discovered that he was the professor of professor of theology at the German Reformed Seminary in Mercersburg, Pennsylvania. Well, here's why this is important. Mercersburg, Pennsylvania was on the other side of the mountain from where I grew up. And so Mercersburg is a place that I was there often, as a boy, as a teenager, as a young adult. It was just like the next town over. I lived in the area of Maryland where Pennsylvania, Maryland, West Virginia, Virginia all come together. So you could be in a different state. You could be in 4 different states in about 20 minutes, depending on where you're at, all right? So I realized that night that most likely, because that church where my ancestors built that church, I realized that was the first German Reformed church in that part of the colonial America in the early 1700s. And Philip Schaff was the professor at the seminary in the mid-1800s. I'm thinking sometime 1850s, 60s, 70s, sometime in that area. So most likely, I think it's safe to assume that members of my family personally knew Philip Schaff and heard him teach and preach. And that night after the funeral, I was just stunned. I was amazed at what God was revealing to me. And He was showing me, son, I'm revealing to you your stock, your history, your DNA. You come from a long line of stout, or I should say devout Christians who carried the faith, carried the cross from Europe to colonial America, who carved out an existence in the wilderness, who had to fight off attacks by Indians, but they planted the church, they planted the cross, they preached the gospel, and Philip Schaff was their theologian. And so I have this deep appreciation for Philip Schaff. So anyhow, this book here, this is the Teaching of the 12 Apostles, written by Philip Schaff. Now, here's how I'm tying this all together. This was published, let me see here. I'm going to take my glasses off. All right. I want to say, this is the revision. 1890 is the revision. I want to say the somewhere around 1882, 83, I think it's 1882 is when he published the history of the Christian church, the 11 or 12 volumes. The Didache was discovered by the Greek Orthodox Archbishop, what did I say, 1873, okay? So, Philip Schaff, when he found out about it, he immediately went to Europe and met, I'll open this up. I want you to see this is the Archbishop. That's the Greek Archbishop who found the Didache in 1873. And so Philip Schaff immediately got on a ship, went to Europe and met with him. And Philip Schaff obviously read Greek, Latin, German. I don't know how many languages the man read. Now think about it. He didn't have the internet. He didn't have cell phones. He didn't have even an electric typewriter, let alone computers. He didn't have jets to travel. How did this man write so much about the church? And he would go to Europe. He would go to the Middle East. He would go to Jerusalem. He would go to Damascus. He would go to Armenia, and he would read the ancient documents in the native language they were written in, and he would understand and translate into English. The man was brilliant. And we think we're so smart today with all this technology that we have. I think we're actually dumber. I think we're dumbing down. But people were brilliant in those days because they didn't have all the distractions. They were focused. They had deep work. They would deep focus. And so he immediately went to Europe to read the document, to meet with the Archbishop, to see the document. And then he came back and he published this book, and this is an original. And his preface is dated May 21st, 1885. 1885. The book is, here's the official, I'm going to give you, I know, get the camera to zoom in on this. This is an original book. This is not a reproduction. This is an original book from 1885. All right. I'm going to read it to you. This is the official title. The oldest church manual, called the Teaching of the 12 Apostles, the Didache, in kindred documents in the original, with translations and discussions of post-apostolic teaching, baptism, worship, and discipline, and with illustrations and facsimiles of the Jerusalem manuscript. That's the title. All right. Well, the Didache is divided into several sections that include rules about the Lord's Supper, baptism, daily prayer, and fasting. And for example, it says the Christians should fast on Wednesdays and Fridays. Now, I've rambled a lot here. I was planning to read the Didache to you, part of it, but I'm going to save that for tomorrow. So come back tomorrow for Morning Manna, give you a little bit of church history, and I'll read a couple chapters of the Didache to you about the two ways, and you will learn something about the early church. God bless. Hey, please share Morning Manna with your friends and family on social media, and just keep this growing. This Bible study is growing. We have thousands of people coming to Bible study every day online and participating in Morning Manna, and I'm having a lot of fun. It's a lot more fun than reading the news. And so keep it up, keep sharing it. Let's keep making this bigger and bigger and bigger and more popular. And I'm having a lot of fun teaching the Word of God and talking about early church history. So share this on social media, and I'll see you later today with True News TV and True News Radio. God bless.